Thank you very much. Before I start the agenda today, can I welcome both Councillor David Chaplin and Councillor Tony Rogers to their first Audit Committee meeting. Item 1, apologies for absence. I think they're all present.
Correct, Chair. Everyone present.
Thank you. Item 2, any declarations of interest. Members are reminded of their personal responsibility to declare any personal or prejudicial interest in respect of matters contained in this agenda in accordance with the provisions of the Local Government and Finance Act 1992 relating to council tax, the Local Government Act 2000, the Council's Constitution and the Members' Code of Conduct. And you have to note A or B. So any declarations of interest? No. That's the case then. We will go straight on to item 3. That's Wales Audit Office Financial Sustainability Assessment, Merthyr Tydfil County Borough Councils, and Audit Wales National Financial Sustainability Report, and has to receive the report of the Wales Audit Office, or Audit Wales, I think as they know now, and that's on pages 3 to 34. So Helen, would you like to take us through the report, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I'm going to swap the order around if you don't mind, committee. So first of all, I'm just going to take you through the main findings of our National Financial Sustainability Report. So this was one that was published earlier last week, and then take you through then the individual findings for Merthyr Tydfil. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to run through the key points of both reports, so I'd be happy to take any questions at the end, if that's okay.
Yes, that's fine.
So earlier this year, we undertook a financial sustainability review across all councils in Wales, and the results for Merthyr were due to be reported earlier in the year, but the committee was cancelled due to the pandemic. So we'll come back to the fuller findings for Merthyr in a little while. But the main findings that we found at that time was that councils across Wales were in a very different positions in terms of their overall level of reserves and track record of spending within their agreed budgets. So the national report that we released last week therefore sets out a baseline position before the pandemic upon which we can progress our 2020-21 review later in the year. It also sets out the initial financial implications of the pandemic for local councils and the scale of the anticipated challenge going forward, against which you can consider the position for Merthyr Tydfil. The key conclusions of the national report were as follows. So firstly, the councils and the Welsh Government have worked well together to mitigate the impact of the pandemic to date, but the future sustainability of the sector is an ongoing challenge, despite Welsh Government announcing £264 million in financial support in August 2020 for the remainder of this current financial year. The report found that some councils were better placed financially than others to respond to the challenges of the pandemic, given their level reserves and their track record of spending within budget. Some usable reserves as a proportion of the net cost of services of around 13%, the average for Wales being around 18%. However, the impact of demand-led services, such as those in social services, for example, looked after children, in smaller councils such as Merthyr can be significant, and pressure on these types of services is likely to intensify as a result of the pandemic. The cost of the pandemic to councils is significant, although a large proportion of the short-term impact has been mitigated through the provision of extra funding through the Welsh Government. However, the extent to which this will fully fund the cost of dealing with the pandemic, particularly over the medium to long term, is currently unknown. I say cost, but costs in their true sense relates to the increased costs of the services provided, but also we must consider the loss of income to the council, for example, car parking, school meals, things like that. There is clear uncertainty around the future costs, income loss and Welsh Government funding, therefore, and makes it difficult for councils to plan over the medium term. But this medium-term financial planning is crucial to ensure the financial sustainability of councils such as Merthyr Tydfil, which is the main finding of our local report. Authorities are likely to face difficult choices over the short and medium term, hence good strategic financial planning and robust governance and decision-making arrangements become even more important in these times. So now if I just take you through to our local report, and I should have said at the beginning, sorry, that both the national and the local report were developed in conjunction with and agreed with the Society of Welsh Treasurers. So everybody was involved in the development of the scope of the reports. So with the local work that we did earlier in the year, I summarise those findings, but please bear in mind that this report was compiled kind of late 2019, early 2020. So a lot has happened in Wales since then, and indeed within Merthyr Tydfil itself, but the findings are still relevant to a large extent. So our overall conclusion was that despite a higher than expected settlement, the council's financial position is still challenging, and failure to deliver to budget or make planned savings risk depleting reserves to a low level. And this overall position still applies. With regards to the 6 sub-findings, I'll go through these in turn. So the council's medium-term financial plan sets out its forecast budget deficits, but it does not set out how these will be addressed in order to improve its financial sustainability. For 2021, 3.5 million is still the funding gap, increasing to 9.9 million of the term of the current MTFP. The council's performance against budget has fluctuated in recent years, and it has therefore used a significant amount of reserves to finance the shortfall. The outfund for 1920, as reported to the last committee, was favourable with a surplus of 2.9 million, but 1.6 million of this resulted from reprofiling of the minimum revision and distribution of funds from the crematory and joint committee reserves rather than planned long-term efficiencies. The council needs to identify and deliver recurrent efficiency savings which will reduce the budget gap over the medium to long term. Current planned savings have been achieved, but they are not sufficient to reduce the forecast deficits. The council has already taken action to strengthen its level of reserves, with less being used in 1920, whereby the reserves actually increased and less are forecast to be used for 2021. This is a positive step for Merthyr Tydfil in order to protect against future, perhaps significant unforeseen budget pressures. The council, compared to its peers, has a relatively low level of council tax collection, which over the last 6 months has significantly reduced due to the COVID pandemic. Officers need to consider this against its financial position and also consult early with members with regard to setting rates for 21-22 and beyond, which will have a significant impact on reducing or increasing the budget gap. Finally, the 6th subheading of our conclusions with regards to borrowing. So this is a statement of fact, and we understand the council is currently considering ways to increase its revenue streams. So that brings to a close my summary of the 2 reports. We will shortly embark upon our 2020-21 financial sustainability work, and this will be reported to the committee in early next year. And Ian, who undertake the work jointly, are happy to answer any questions that the committee may have, and perhaps Steve Jones can help as well if we can't answer any of the more technical or detailed questions. Thank you for your time. Sorry, is the chair going to field the questions or shall I?
I think we might have lost the chair.
Okay.
I don't see Clive's icon on the screen there at all.
Yeah, it actually looks like he's dropped out. So as Vice Chair, would you like me to step in and control the meeting until Clive's able to rejoin us?
I think that just it would be wise there, Darren.
Okay. I can see two hands up. The first one indicated to speak was David Chaplin, and then after David we'll have Bob Williams. Over to you, David.
Yeah, thank you, Vice Chair. From the report, it obviously states really basically the council needs to reduce the budget gap. Over the last few years, there has been concerns that the medium-term financial plan came to council late to make any decisions. Bearing in mind that the climate we're under, surely there should be a timetable set now to look at the MTFP to bring it as soon as possible and bring it forward. Is there a timetable set out yet?
I think, Steve, that might be best one for you.
Answer that one. Yes, we certainly have a timetable in play. And what we're currently doing now is looking at options and to set the budget for next year and to address our current funding gaps. What we don't know at this point in time is our settlement for next financial year. And the indications are that we probably won't receive the draft settlement until December the 8th to the 15th. So that is going to be quite late. But what the plan is that there'll be all councillor workshops held next month. And that'll be looking at some of the options which the managers have actually identified for next financial year. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think that will help because in the last few years, the workshops have started in about the January time, and I think that was late. So if they can start next month, I think that would be beneficial for everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, I welcome that as well, Steve. Helen mentioned in part of her local report that the consultation with members regarding council tax needs to start as early as possible. Naturally, we need to know what our settlement is going to be from Welsh Government, but you know that dialogue needs to start as soon as possible. So I agree with Councillor Chaplin on that. Bob, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Helen, you mentioned the fact that the council's income has changed tremendously for various reasons. But also the expenditure is going to change, and the baseline for expenditure won't really be determined until we've gone through at least, I would say, a full year to see what the consequences of costs are, and therefore setting a baseline to enable short or even medium-term financial planning. So with that in mind, I think again, it's my question is similar to the timescales and how fast it will be for the council to assess its risks, starting with strategic risks or corporate risks, and work all the way through. That's going to take quite a bit of time, and therefore the expectancy for a medium-term financial plan might not really manifest itself until well into next year.
Yeah, that's one for me again, I think, isn't it? And it's, as I said, really, we are meeting as a corporate management team over the next couple of weeks, and we're going to explore all of the service opportunities and all the opportunities which have been identified by just our service managers. We then plan to meet our cabinet then and to go through all the options before our council workshops then next month. It's still the case that we will be setting our budget for next financial year That'll be done the first week in March of next year. And also we'll be setting in place then our 4-year TFP. So that is still the plan. Obviously, what we don't know at the present time is the settlement. We still have to explore then what the implications are from COVID into next financial year. And I'm sure that the Welsh Government will be including some of those additional costs, etc., and loss of income within the settlement. But still, we have to plan for just a range of settlements because we don't know what it is. So that's what we're currently doing now, and trying then to address exactly how we would meet a funding gap of ranging then between £1 million up to about £5 million. So that is the task ahead of us. And as I say, really, that's still something that we will have to address and we'll have to explore then before we set our budget in March.
Thank you, Steve. I'm back in. Now my battery I found was unplugged, so I'm back on. Any other questions?
Just to recap, Chair, while you were off, we had a question off Councillor Chaplin, which was answered by Helen, and Bob Williams asked a question, and that was answered by Steve. So you caught the tail end of that, so you're back up to speed.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? If not, I've got one for
Councillor Tuvey is indicating, Chair.
Right. Sorry. Yeah, you're quite right.
Yeah.
Councillor Tuvey?
Yes, it was just a comment, really. In the report,
sorry,
it said...
We're still on questions.
Oh, a big fan. I'll come back later then.
Okay, yeah. Okay. I've got one in respect of the Wales audit. Having read your reports, we've had 10 years of austerity. Now we're into the major effects of coronavirus, which will have an untold effect on the economy of the UK and all the devolved nations. And where you state on the bottom of page 7 that the council needs to identify and deliver recurrent efficiency savings which will help to reduce the to reduce the budget gap over the medium to long term. In your opinion, to achieve that, and all the councils in Wales, it's the difficulty in the allocation of funding to the devolved government in Wales from the UK government, and if this is reduced or possibly kept at the same level without any increase for inflation, could I ask you what your opinion of that scenario is, please?
Obviously, I can't comment on how the government or the Welsh Government's going to fund the councils in the future. All I say was the medium-term financial plan currently sets out the budget gaps in those years going forward. In each year, corporate savings and other savings and efficiencies are identified to meet that gap for the current year. So it's just kind of trying to challenge that thinking and to, along with the improvement board, identify some transformational projects that might change how the council delivers some of its services, and in turn then those savings may be recurrent and realised into the future rather than just 1 year at a time.
Yeah. I just I hear your answer, but we are any authority and any public sector authority is totally reliant on funding at a UK government level, and then to what extent in our case, the Welsh government is affected. You throw in the fact that we've got a major pandemic at the moment, and we have, in my opinion, the most difficult mix in the economy I've ever seen.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there.
Okay. I've got a question on page 14. If that's okay.
The local report?
On the sustainability report, yeah. And there, it refers there under paragraph 27, and I quote, to the council result in less income.
I think we may have lost Clive again.
Yeah, I think he's frozen there, Steve. I think the question that the chair was going to ask, if I've got it right, if it's on page 14 at point 27, is failure to collect the amount of council tax due to council will result in less income. This in turn may increase the financial pressures on the council and require it to make additional savings. Whilst council tax is not the biggest source of funding for councils in Wales, it remains a key income source. I think that's the point that he wanted to raise, but I don't know what the question is around that, I'm afraid, Helen.
Okay.
I'm not on a very good day, Councillor Roberts, but I'm back in, thanks. My question was, the council tax collection rate decreased in 2018-19. It then went back up in 2019-20, but because of coronavirus in this current financial year, and obviously because of that, so far, I think it started again. There's been little or no enforcement, and I understand one of the latest figures I've had sight of is that leaves us in the current financial £670,000 that needs to be recovered. Really, you know, I think we need to know as an audit committee what steps are being deployed to recover this amount of money. So that, you know, that brings us right up to where we are in October 2020. So it's something that you highlighted, Helen, in the report there, but my question really is perhaps directed at Steve Jones.
Okay, thank you, Clive. As you're aware that we didn't enforce any council tax for the first number of months of this financial year, we did then start a softer recovery back in the summer. It was in July, and that was a very sensitive start, really, in looking at some of the council tax debt. We've now started to enforce a little bit more, but it's as the point is made, really. It is the case that we haven't collected a certain amount of council tax monies. It's not to say that we won't collect all that money, but obviously it could well be the case that it could be collected at a later date. So it could well be the case that we don't collect all the council tax which is owed in this financial year. At this point in time, the Welsh government are just acutely aware of every authority and just recovering council tax, and there could be some assistance at some stage. We are still awaiting further news, but we are still hopeful that there just will be some further support.
Thank you, Steve. I've got no further questions if there aren't any. Could I ask for any comments, please?
Councillor Salmon has got his hand up, Chair.
Yes.
I don't know if it's a question.
Yeah, I can see it, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I didn't put it up until the end, to be honest, because my internet's dropping is the same as yourself.
Right.
Question. In the report, it said council has no borrowing to fund commercial activities, and borrowing to fund commercial activity has the potential to generate additional income to fund council services. However, it can also bring significant risks that would be associated with any commercial activity. Helen, is this something you recommend for councils, that they look at commercial borrowing to maybe to generate extra money? And whether you do or don't, is there any councils out there that do a good job of it, and that we could look to that could give us ideas?
Okay, I think it's for each council to understand, to take their own assessment of the risks of such borrowing to fund commercial activities, and also consider the payback and future income streams for that, and if it's worth that investment. With regards any good examples, unless Ian wants to come in with any particular good examples he's aware of, I can't actually cite any now, but I can take that away and try and find out and bring some information back to the committee if that would be helpful.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Helen.
One thing I would say is that last week, at the same time we produced the National Report on Financial Sustainability, we've also published a report on commercialisation in local government. So I would recommend, well, that's obviously of relevance to your question, and I'd recommend that was read anyway. There's a lot in there. It's a local government national study that's just been published. There's a lot in there about commercialisation in local government, and I think that would be of particular interest to you on that question.
Good. Thank you for that, both Helen and yourself. Is it possible to either send us the link of that to all audit committee members, particularly, to have a look at?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Should I send it via Maya? Would it be, and then she can distribute?
Yes, via Democratic Services.
Yeah, I'll do that straight after this meeting.
Lovely. And
or it can be accessed via our Audit Wales website under publications. It'll probably be one of the first ones that comes up.
Yeah, it is on the website, but I'll send the link for ease of access if you like.
yes, we will have members going on your website, but I suspect if you send us the link, you're more or less guaranteed to have a lot more members looking at it.
No problem.
Thank you for that. And Councillor Tony Rogers, I saw you.
Chair, I got one more, if that's okay.
Oh, sorry. Before you bring in Councillor Rogers, carry on. Sorry,
Chair. I should have left my hand up and make it
easier. Yeah. Carry on.
Helen, Mark, and maybe Ian as well. As you are all well placed to know the state of this council's finances, do you actually make recommendations to Welsh Government on how much Merthyr Tydfil should get in its financial settlement when it comes out in November, December? Because it just seems to me a lot of people say that some of the bigger councils get bigger settlements, obviously because they've got maybe more residents, but we're kind of penalised because we're a small local authority offering the same services that maybe those bigger councils offer, and they've got the added benefit maybe of having more residents and collecting more council tax.
We don't get involved with influencing in any way the Welsh Government's distribution of its funding to councils. However, we are in regular contact with the Welsh Government officers and discuss Merthyr Tydfil as we do other councils and their operations, but we don't have any direct influence on their allocations.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Chair, I finished now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, perhaps a similar answer really from myself. We don't recommend to Welsh Government how they allocate their funding is a complicated formula set up, and Steve would have a lot more information around that. It tries to take account of a lot of different factors. If I could, I would recommend Merthyr Tydfil had more money based on my experience, but I'm afraid we're not able to do that, unfortunately.
Okay. Councillor Tony Rogers, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your nice words of welcome. I've been on this authority off and on a long time, probably nudging 40 years, but I've never been on audit.
There we
and
are.
It's a fascinating subject.
It
but
is.
Having read the report and gone through it thoroughly, and I think that there's a lot of work to be done with this local authority, whoever's going to do it, because the days of taking funding out again is finished. I think if we got to get it right, or if it's not right, we've got to take steps to meet people to supplement or whatever to keep this local authority going. Because reserves, I think, that's the end of reserves. We've got to forget about reserves. Then we've got to get it right. And I'm sure that at the end of the day we can do it. But it's going to be a hard job because the situation the country's in, the situation we're in. But to maintain services, we've got to do it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I was going to go on to comments, but you've made yours, Councillor Rogers. Any other comments, Councillor Salmon?
Thank you, Chair. It's just the one it is, to be honest. And all right. Despite a high, this is what's mentioned in the summary of the report. Despite a higher than expected settlement, the council's financial position is still challenging. Now, all 33 councillors in the local authority should know exactly the situation we're in. But I'm not singling anyone out, and I'm not being political, to be honest, when I could be. But I'm just wondering maybe if Mark and Helen and Ian could come in and do a little talk for councillors after what happened last Wednesday in full council, where a report was coming through and people wanted to bring in an amendment that would have cost the council £278,000 extra. I'm just wondering if you could come in, because some people don't seem to realise exactly the situation we're in, and doing things like that just it puts in jeopardy 60,000 residents of Merthyr Tydfil. Just maybe you could look at doing a little talk for councillors, please, Helen.
Ellen, did you want to say anything?
We can take that away and discuss it with the engagement director and see what might be the best way going forward to assist you. Would that be helpful?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, happy to be involved in any discussion. See what can be done.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Any other comments from members? Councillor Tubby?
No, it was basically what Declan was saying earlier. I would be very reluctant to borrow large sums of money to fund commercial activities, because it puts if we were to borrow, say, £5 million to buy something, puts it at a lot of risk, and councils, I don't think, have got a good track record running commercial activity. So I'd be interested to see this report that the audit office has come out with, really. That was all I was going to say.
Okay, yeah, fine. Thank you, Councillor Tubby. Councillor Roberts?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just picking up on Councillor Salmon's point, really, about last Wednesday. We're still waiting on a business case and a full cost analysis to come back regarding the proposals. And even though I think Councillor Salmon isn't making a political point, he is in the fact that he's raised it, the amendment put forward. And I don't want to digress further, but there was a recommendation that came forward at the meeting, which is going to substantially increase the cost to the service anyway. So let's not throw stones here at the moment, because we're still waiting on the full business case and the analysis to come back to council, and we see where we are. And obviously the proposal put forward would have benefited the 60-odd thousand residents of the county borough. But I'm digressing now, Chair. I think that's a debate for another time. Thank you.
It is indeed. Thank you, Councillor Roberts. Nobody else comment? If not, it does say here on the agenda to receive the report of the Wales Audit Office, pages 3 to 34. So just to make sure that I'm doing things correctly, I'll go through all the names of the council members, and if you're quite happy to receive the report, you indicate yes after I've called your name. So I'll start off, and it's in alphabetical order. Councillor Chaplin?
Yes.
Councillor Jeremy Davis?
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Roberts?
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Tony Rogers?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Declan Salmon?
Yes, Chair, happy to receive.
Councillor John Thomas?
Yes, Chair.
Clive Turvey?
Chair.
And Mr. Robert Williams?
Yes, Chair.
Thank you. And my answer is yes as well. So we're unanimous in that. And thank you, Helen, for taking us through there and answering the questions.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you. Item 4, that's the Audit Wales presentation, raising our game, tackling fraud in Wales. And that's a presentation from yourselves. It's pages 35 to 46. And Ian, you taking us through it.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Yeah, the slides are in your pack. I'm not proposing to go through them verbatim, but just to give you a bit of context. There was a national report in July last year that was followed up by local work across all councils and other bodies in Wales that fed into a second report that was published in July this year. So I wasn't part of the national report team, but I'll do my best to answer any questions. But I did do the local work at Merthyr. So the bulk of these slides are on the national report findings, but the final slide is specific to Merthyr. So I'll just take you through these. What our work found nationally was, it's very difficult to put an exact number on the losses due to fraud, but they are significant. Respected sort of analysts advise that within Welsh public sector, it would be between 100 million to £1 billion per annum lost to fraud and error. Despite the whichever end of the scale you're talking there's obviously significant losses to the public purse. But our report did find that there is some degree of scepticism about the level of fraud within organisations, but that doesn't tend to be based on particular evidence, and it does run counter to the research that's been done by the likes of CIPFA and the UK Government Counter Fraud Service. We've also found, this year there's been sadly a very good reminder of how agile and how quickly fraudsters adapt to new opportunities. So there was, the slides there cite the Grenfell fire tragedy and how individuals have been jailed for fraud in respect to that. But the floods and obviously in COVID, there's been lots of fraudulent activity. So anything that happens in society that fraudsters are quickly seize upon. The original report from June 19, it just provided an overview of the counter-fraud landscape across the Welsh public sector. So obviously, it reiterates there that the losses caused by fraud to the public sector are significant and that fraud is constantly evolving. So counter fraud needs to keep pace with that. And that resources devoted to counter fraud activity vary widely across the public sector in Wales. And we think there's scope for greater collaboration and cross-agency working. That initial report was built on by the phase 2 work. So it was 40 audited bodies across Wales. We asked these questions really. The first question was on the top tier and the commitment to counter fraud. Then about the structure and the resource to prevent and detect fraud, the policy frameworks that were in place, the fraud risk assessment arrangements, and the organisation's internal control environments, whether organisations have an appropriate response to fraud, and whether there's proper reporting and scrutiny in place to ensure that the framework for counter fraud is operating effectively. The key national findings were, we think that there's a need to strengthen strategic leadership across the public sector in terms of counter fraud and oversight of it. A need to increase counter fraud capacity and capabilities, particularly in local government, and explore further the sharing of resource and expertise across public bodies. A need to do both proactive and reactive counter fraud work. A lot of the counter fraud work that's done is reactive, but there's scope to, there's benefits to doing more proactive work. A need for training and staff awareness in counter fraud to be improved, and a better evaluation of fraud risks and sharing of fraud information within and across sectors. The next slide is phase 1 overview of the sector in local government. This is just a bit of background really. Recent history, the austerity measures reduced internal capacity to investigate fraud, and in 2014 a lot of skilled investigators within housing benefit teams transferred to the single fraud investigation service. I believe that was the case in Merthyr as well. So as a result, a lot of councils lost a sort of dedicated counter fraud team or resource, and internal audit plugged those gaps without necessarily being counter fraud specialists. But because they do other work, you know, they have their own programs of work, resources are relatively limited. We also do national fraud initiative reports every couple of years, and the commitment to that is variable across councils. So again, this is an overview from the phase 1 report. So individual councils are responsible for their own culture, counter fraud culture and policies. Because of the lack of resources, they tend to focus more on investigations. What informal networks there are rather ad hoc and not necessarily particularly focused on counter fraud. And although councils recognise the benefit of collaboration, there are barriers that they perceive of time, cost and data sharing sensitivities that they've put forward as some of the reasons that prevent that from not happening. Councils typically provide information to their audit committees on cases of identified fraud, but this is variable in terms of format and how often audit committees get this information. The aggregate information on losses and types of fraud, sanctions and recoveries is not currently collected across councils. And information about fraud cases is not formally shared between councils to help raise awareness and strengthen counter fraud controls. The key national findings from the second national report were that there is an absence of sector-wide strategic leadership, as I've mentioned. We found some authorities, you know, espouse a zero tolerance of fraud, but we do think there's more that could be done to reinforce tone at the top across the board. Some local authorities, well, many local authorities, sorry, haven't really invested in counter fraud arrangements, only have a few of the key components in place, and haven't done a fraud risk assessment for some time. Capacity is obviously an ongoing challenge. There are some authorities who've got experienced and skilled counter fraud staff, but generally it's now done by internal audit teams, as is the case at Merthyr. We think that counter fraud arrangements tend to be more advanced where there is a dedicated counter fraud resource. And And so where the internal audit teams do carry out the work, that's hampered to a certain extent by their general programme of assurance work, which they need to prioritise. I think that pooling and sharing of resources needs to be considered as a solution. The report refers to the use of data analytics and developing that as a means of preventing fraud. In some local authorities, several teams play a role in the counter fraud work, which it can be understandable in terms of adding capacity, but it can result in a lack of coordination at times. Some local authorities don't have a fraud response plan that is clearly signposted to staff. We didn't really find any examples, or very few examples, where local authorities are working frequently across internal and external boundaries and sharing information. Fewer than half the authorities report information about fraud losses, fraud cases, losses and recoveries. And we found that outside of the NHS, audit committees need to be more proactive in recognising the increasing risk of fraud and asking the searching questions about fraud risk or the lack of information that they're being supplied with about fraud risk. When we carried out the local work tail end of 2019, early 2020, we wrote to the council, including these bullet points that are on the final slide in your pack. We found that Merthyr specifically needed to update its anti-fraud and corruption policy. It was many years out of date. We think senior management need to consider ways it can strengthen its approach to promoting the importance of good anti-fraud culture. The council should consider ways it can do more proactive counter-fraud work as well as the reactive investigatory stuff. That a comprehensive fraud risk assessment should be produced and discussed with CMT and yourselves as audit committee. That a fraud response plan should be developed and communicated to all staff. And then a final point was consider ways that an appropriate level of fraud related information could be provided to audit committee, and how yourselves as audit committee can promote counter fraud matters and have more oversight of counter fraud arrangements. So that final slide is just the specific things that we think Merthyr needs to do to tighten its framework around counter fraud. So I'd be happy to take any questions on the local or the national report. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Before I ask any questions, Mark, do you wish to come in and add anything to what Ian said in relation to the local situation?
Yes, certainly, Chair, if I could. Yeah, very pleased to see this report coming forward, really, because it shows how long I've been around. I was involved in setting up a counter fraud team in Merthyr in the 1990s when there was basically no resource put into counter fraud in those days, not just in Merthyr Tydfil, any local government to speak of, really. And the government at the time did recognise that was a weakness and brought in an incentive scheme to actually incentivise councils to actually investigate fraud. And that was the start, really, of specialist fraud teams being established back then, and authorities were very successful at it, were very proficient at it, so much so they had to reduce the incentives because authorities were basically generating too much funding for themselves in addressing fraud. Anyway, over time, those counter fraud teams were developed and trained and so on, networks created. So many of the things that Ian has rightly flagged up were actually in place many years ago. And then I think the key word for me it's a combination of austerity that we've talked about earlier on, and a decision made at national government level, Department of Work and Pensions, to actually centralise counter fraud investigation work linked to benefits, and that was the biggest volume of work, really. But that gave enough of work to have a team that was able to do that work and some other things as well, like proactive work and more corporate work. So as Ian said, Merthyr Tydfil is typical in that regard. Back in 2016, the team was transferred over to DWP. and all the staff transferred. There was a business case made to try and retain some staff, but again, due to austerity and budget pressures, because we couldn't guarantee potentially how much additional income or losses could be recovered, it was felt quite a risky sort of proposition to retain some counter fraud staff. So exactly as Ian has described, that work then had to be absorbed by the existing internal audit team, whose prime role is to review how the authorities operate and carry out audits and to give an opinion on internal control. So it's that competing priority. Nevertheless, the work around National Fraud Initiative has been coordinated by internal audit and actually responding to allegations of fraud, and that's still been done over the last number of years. But there's no substitute for having a dedicated team, even if it's one or two individuals who've got those specialist skills to actually focus on dealing with fraud. And I think that's the key thing. There's a number of things that, again, Ian rightly flags up that needed to be addressed in Merthyr Tydfil in terms of updating the policy, developing a fraud response plan, fraud action plan, investigation protocol. We've actually done that over the summer by one of the benefits of having the shared service. We can access information that authorities have done. We've actually developed those. They just need to go through the formal approval process within the authority. But the key thing is, and I'm having discussions with the likes of Steve as to how potentially we could actually create a dedicated resource. And I'm not talking about lots of people. It may be one person. That's what generally is the case in other authorities. The 4 authorities that I cover, there's one dedicated person in the Vale, there's one dedicated person in Bridgend. There is a slightly bigger team of 2 or 3 people in Rhondda and Taff, and then further afield you will have dedicated teams in likes of Swansea and Cardiff. But other authorities, as Ian has described, you might have 1 or less individuals. It's not always down to resources, but you do need a minimum sort of level of resource to actually do this effectively. In terms of reporting, I think what went alongside losing some of the team was that focus and being able to report regularly. We did report in the annual audit report in terms of the counter fraud work, and it did make reference to the stuff that we have done during the year, but it's not on the frequency that it used to be, and it needs to be to have that focus. So there's quite a bit that has been done. There's quite a bit that needs to be done. But part of it is identifying some resource to actually make it happen in reality. Otherwise, we would be just paying lip service to it, I think, in reality. So apologies for the long sort of history lesson, but I think it is useful to compare what was in place previously and how it was lost. And yeah, I think the mention was made of health, for example. When local government established counter fraud teams back in the 90s, there was nothing in health. And what's happened is local government has lost that resource, and health have become very professional and have identified the need and the appropriateness of having specialists in those roles. So it's not about a competition, but health have overtook local government then with what they've got in place now. So I think we need to go back to where we were in many ways, and taking account of the technology that's available to help us to do that more effectively as well going forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. Before I bring in any members of questions, just to follow up the point that you've referred to, particularly with discussions with Steve Jones and the Director of Finance, would you be in a position to report back to the Audit Committee the outcome of those discussions in relation to where we're going with fraud?
Yes, I was going to say I'm looking at Steve, but I can't see Steve, so I'm not looking at him. But yeah, I'm sure we can come back, whether it's the next audit committee or the one after that. Obviously, it's funding related, and I know, back to the previous reports, it is a very difficult situation when authorities having to prioritise its resources. But based on what I've seen elsewhere, we should be able to actually cover the costs of somebody in that role over time. It might be a bit of an investment to start with, but over time you get quite a bit of that money back, I would venture. But that's the trouble, you can't guarantee it, and it will go up and down in cycles depending on the nature of the fraud that you find and so on. Okay,
well, Steve, you're still there. Can you confirm that you agree with Mark that you can come back and let us know what the outcome is?
So have a conversation, yes, Mark. We will come back to a future meeting, Chair.
Right, because it's a very important subject. We cover, as it states in a different report earlier, 2,600 staff and a whole plethora of services that we have to cover. So it's a particularly important subject. Thank you. Questions from members? Councillor Roberts. And then I'll follow with Bob Williams.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ian, for that synopsis of the report. It was very, very, very useful. I mean, I read the report twice, but when you go through it, you obviously pick out things that don't necessarily pick up on. Obviously, when you look at something like the floods, the pandemic, and things like this, fraud is unfortunately rears its ugly head, and there's opportunists out there which will try to capitalise on it. Now, I know the Welsh Government gave substantial amounts of money to the local authority to administer with the floods from Storm Dennis and also from the COVID pandemic. And those were administered very, very successfully by the team at Merthyr Tydfil County Borough Council. I was just wondering what measures we have in place as a local authority just to double check that there hasn't been any fraudulent activity, i.e. people claiming for things that they're not entitled to, or claiming at a higher level when they should be at a lower level. So it's just a general question, really. Will there be a checks and balances? Will there be some sort of audit into what we've done as a local authority, which has, like I said, has been highly successful in the amount of businesses and individuals that have been assisted. But you know, unfortunately, it's a fact of life that there are opportunities out there that will try to capitalise from the goodwill of the Welsh Government and the local authority with the funds.
I think Mark might want to come in on that one. I would say that in terms of the points that we've raised, in terms of the tightening up of the framework, the things that we think needed to be in place, for example, you know, a better policy, a fraud response plan, etc. All that'll help, and we will monitor the sort of implementation as part of our ongoing assurance piece of work, really. But in terms of what the council has done in recent times, because the work, this local work was pre-pandemic. I thought Mark might want to come in on that one.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Chair. Just certainly from perhaps a more of a regional context, and it was one thing that I think Ian did say actually when he was introduced presenting his report about there wasn't much evidence of sharing intelligence and so on in an organised way. Well, actually, that's one of the things that did really happen, sort of at the linked to the grants linked to COVID, and I think it was because people were very alive to the fact that potentially there was scope for unscrupulous individuals and businesses trying to take advantage of the situation. So I know I personally was sharing a lot of information that we were been made aware of, both formally and informally, of attempted frauds. That you had people impersonating businesses, particularly the chains, and saying that they hadn't had their grants and so on, and targeting every local authority and so on. So we did a lot of that to prevent that happening nationally, but particularly regionally. In terms of the processes that were put in place, there was obviously a major emphasis on grants being paid out as quickly as possible to prevent businesses from going under, which was obviously the whole purpose. But there's obviously a balance to be struck to make sure that you were paying the right amounts to the right people. And again, procedures were developed at different authorities. They were all shared to try and make those as robust as they could be, but still not preventing payments being made in a timely way. So again, all that information was shared. A number of authorities actually used an organisation called CFAS to actually share electronically the information on who they'd actually paid. That was compared with a national fraud database in terms of known fraudulent individuals and companies. That was slightly after the event, but nevertheless, it was to try and sort of, okay, let's see if we have potentially paid out to people that we shouldn't have. And the National Fraud Initiative is also going to be doing a similar exercise exercise, again, it'll be looking backwards to see the extent of problems. And I know some authorities were victims of fraud, but perhaps they were the ones who, you're always going to get one or two slip through the net for obvious reasons. But generally, if you have reasonably strong basic controls in place, you'll prevent the vast majority of them, and that's been my experience in terms of the region. Steve may have a bit more information on the specifics in Merthyr, but those are the sorts of things that we actually did do, and then there were different grants being rolled out for different types of businesses, and again, it was making sure that you had those basic controls in place and basic questions were being asked. So personally, based on what I know regionally, it happened pretty well. There were a few attempted frauds, but generally speaking, they were prevented. Not to say that there may have been one or two, and one or two may come out of these matching exercises after the event. But generally, what I know about it, it was fairly well managed, particularly given the very challenging circumstances that everyone was facing at that time.
Okay, before I bring in Robert, Steve, you want to add to that?
If I could add as well, Chair, thank you, Chair, is that we also set up in Merthyr, we also had a grants working group, and that involved officers from our business rate section, and it also then involved officers from just the economic development section as well. So there was a huge amount of sharing of just knowledge there as well. So as Mark has basically said, it worked very, very well, in fact, and we had those counter checks as well then between business rates and also then the numbers of staff from just those officers who knew what was happening then in these local areas. So I think it worked well. And as Mark has just alluded to as well, I'm not aware of any fraudulent claims either.
Okay.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Okay, right.
Sorry, Chair, can I just confirm that the Cabinet member, Councillor Andrew Barry, had to leave, he's got a Welsh Government grants meeting?
Right. Yeah, I did
Thank
see the
you.
message. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Robert?
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I think to Mark, in discussions previously with Gary, I think he calls them special investigations, which are current or live potential fraud investigations. Can you give us an idea of what the current level or number of investigations are, which really is for me a bit of an indication, if you can look back over years and see, is it increasing or is it constant or is it decreasing? It gives you a feel for the volume and the level, making reference to, I think, what you just said about the amount of resources that you need. Yeah. You're trying to judge the amount of resources you need before you jump in and say, we go into resource it. You've got to get a level of what the activity is. And I'll come back to my previous question. When the chair had snuck off and made a cup of tea, Declan was making his non-political point. My question was relative to the massive changes that are going to occur. Things are not going to be the same. Everything is going to change, and that changes operating procedures. And to give an example of one that concerns me most in terms of risk is the rush to work from home for everybody. That in itself is going to be a fantastic opportunity for fraudsters through the IT system or through collusion or through various means to potentially have a massive impact on fraud. So I was involved in what Mark referred to earlier with the NHS establishment of fraud investigations and the way we tackled them. And the basis of that was a cost-benefit analysis. Hence my question about trying to get a judgment on the volume of what's going on at the moment, and then assess that in terms of what's going to happen with the changes in operational procedures right across the board, which then brings me all the way back to the fact that from the top, the whole operating procedures must be risk assessed in terms of economy, savings, fraud, and many other aspects. So it's to Mark really to get a feel for the volume that we've currently got, assess what is going to come, and then maybe do a cost benefit analysis to say what resources would be needed to tackle it. I would agree with Mark. I think there is an opportunity, having set up his joint group audit team, to ride it with that, because there is good exchange of information opportunities within that group.
Mark?
Oh, yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Bob. Yeah, it's got quite a lot in there, really. Just to try and pick them off in order, if I can. In terms of, yeah, you're right to say that we generally call them special investigations. They generally refer to sort of internal type allegations of fraud, corporate type fraud, that as I would describe them, and that's what internal audits still deal with. And it certainly goes in cycles. If I've learned nothing else over my career, that this certainly goes up and down, and it's been very much in an upward sort of curve the last couple of years, and at the moment it's in a downward curve. Could speculate as for the reasons for that, and is that because, you know, people aren't in the office in the way that they were? Is the sort of informal sharing of intelligence not there in the same way because you don't see people in the way that you used to do? I can't believe that fraud isn't happening. I don't believe that, because that's just not human nature. But at the moment, in terms of actual live cases in Merthyr, there aren't any currently for that nature. But there are in other authorities. So yeah, it can be all sorts of reasons, but but to answer your question directly, that's the current position. The other side of the coin, though, is to do with particularly the data matching exercises that have been done periodically in relation to National Fraud Initiative, where you get literally thousands of potential matches that we work through, and we share those with the relevant departments. We've just finished the previous set of matches, and there'll be new lot coming through at the start of the next year. But there are a number of potential fraud or error cases that have been looked at by Council Tax and Revenues Department, a Benefits Department, that are working through currently. So there may well be some coming out of those exercises. They've already been sieved down from the thousands of cases down to about 100 and something. So there may be some coming out of those, but under Steve and Mike Parry's department, they are working through some of those matches now. So so there may be some coming out of those. Yeah. So that was the first sort of bit of the question. Sorry, you did say there were a couple of other points, Bob. Were there a couple of other things in terms? Oh yeah, in terms of the regional audit service, potentially, you know, been developed to deal with fraud. We got a bit of a mixed picture. Rhondda and TAF has got its own team, and it's outside of internal audit. It sits in the sort of revenue sort of part of Rhondda and TAF. There's a dedicated investigator in Bridgend who again sits in that part of the world, although his role has been expanded. And then in the Vale, we have got a dedicated member of staff. He tells us to deal with corporate type fraud, and then works closely with the benefits department in terms of those areas of work. But I have actually used some of those, him and one or two other staff based in the Vale, to actually assist on the National Fraud Initiative work for Merthyr Tydfil. That's one of the advantages of having a wider people to draw on. But I think, as I said earlier, there's no substitute for having a dedicated resource for that particular authority, because it's about the proactive work you do, but it's also knowing what's going on, and that those sort of informal sources of intelligence, and you get those by building up relationships with people and getting to know what's going on, as well as go looking for it in a structured way. So because it's definitely out there.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Robert?
It does. I'll come back to it later, though, Mark, in respect of your plan, your audit plan. I think it's one of the items that you've marked early on in your audit plan under item 5. I'll come back to that later. Thank you, Chair.
Oh, okay. Councillor Chaplin?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Obviously, the future survival of the council, we may have to consider different ways of working. Coming from a background in industry, we used to carry out internal audits on one department auditing another department, those people were trained on auditing, and and that is a way of freeing up resource to allow you to carry out other activities. Have we considered doing things like that ourselves?
Mark, are you going to answer that one?
Do my best. To be honest, it hasn't been done certainly in a systematic way. There have been examples where you get different departments undertaking like a peer review of different departments or even other authorities, or looking at quality control procedures or those sorts of things, but not in a formal internal audit way. Maybe it's because in local government it's a statutory basis for having to have a sort of professional internal audit service. Maybe that's part of the reason, but that's an interesting idea. Is there's the potential, you could argue for seconding some staff into the service to get some experience, both internal audit benefiting and those individuals benefiting from that type of arrangement. So that's something that maybe some consideration could be given to. So yeah, I certainly think about that. That's a good one.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, I've got one, and it's highlighted in the report that Ian's referred to, the national funding. And the last but one dot there, and I quote, it says, fewer than half the authorities report information about fraud cases, losses and recoveries to their audit committees on a regular basis. Could we do something on those lines, Mark, and weave it into our forward programme of agenda items? Because I'm sure all the members of the audit committee would be interested to see information in relation to any of those aspects.
Absolutely, Chair. That's something we used to do. And well, for some members who perhaps put on audit committee many years ago, you probably used to remember seeing those sorts of reports. Yes. And actually copies of press releases and newspaper articles and those sorts of things as well. They used to accompany those sorts of reports. The difference being then, though, as I said earlier, there was a dedicated team, and the volume of cases that were investigated was substantial. If you haven't got dedicated resource, you're not going to have the same numbers. The principle is absolutely right. I think we just need to make sure that we got the resource around that to make it worthwhile, and members get the information that they should be getting. So it's how we do it within the resources that we've got, and how we could do it with a bit of extra resource going forward as well.
Okay, I'll leave that one with you then, and hopefully we'll have a report in the not too distant future.
Yeah.
Okay, no other questions from any members? If not, any comments from members? No comments. Can I thank you, Ian, for that very comprehensive presentation of that report. There's a lot of interesting information in there, and obviously that's the questions flowed from what you've added to and told us what's in the report. Thanks. So again, I'll go through the same procedure. It's to receive a presentation from Audit Wales. I'll call up the names of members. If you agree with the receiving the report, just say yes. Councillor David Chaplin.
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Jeremy Davis.
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Darren Roberts.
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Tony Rogers.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Derek Salmon.
Yes, Chair.
Councillor John Thomas.
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Clive Towey.
Yes, Chair.
Mr. Robert Williams.
Yes, Chair.
And myself, yes. So again, that's unanimous. I go on to the next item on the agenda, and that is item 5, to receive the report of the head of the Regional Internal Audit Service, and it's on pages 47 to 52, and it's over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Yeah, actually, you know, as the lay member mentioned earlier, there are a few of the points that he raised are actually in this report, and perhaps I'll elaborate a little bit on that as I go through. Members will recall that usually we present an internal audit plan much earlier in the year. It's usually sort of March or April time, and that was again planned to be the case, but obviously due to the COVID and the lockdown and the cancellation of meetings, that didn't happen. But nevertheless, we've now brought forward an internal audit plan, a similar time frame to a number of other authorities, because as we know, literally almost overnight, the world changed in the sense of the potential impact on internal controls and ways of working. Not everything has changed, but a lot of things have changed. So what we decided to do, we consulted with senior officers, you know, in January, February time leading up to producing the plan, looked at the various risks that we felt were facing the authority, but we had to revisit that because of the issues I mentioned about the home working, the far more use of IT and so on, a lot of the changes that had to be introduced. So that would obviously impact on our plan going forward. But before I go into too much on that, just to give you a bit of background on section 3 of the report, under the public sector internal audit standards, the head of internal audit must establish a risk-based plan to determine the priorities of the internal audit activity consistent with the organisation's goals. We consult with senior management on potential areas to include in the plan, but then the head of audit has to ensure that there's a sufficient coverage around things like risk management, internal controls and governance to be able to inform the annual opinion that I would be given at the end of this financial year. So paragraph 3.4 on page 48 lists some of the things that we take into consideration, and then moves on to section 4, talking about some of the things that had to be changed as a result of COVID. So the first few paragraphs there in section 4 talks about the changes that were, some of the changes that were made, meetings having to be suspended, basically enabling home working for a raft of staff, and obviously that wasn't peculiar to Merthyr Tydfil, that happened literally across the whole country. So that meant that certain processes and procedures had to change. So the grants, for example, we talked about earlier, that was another quite a big change that authorities had to respond to very quickly. So that's something we have already been involved with, and there'd be a certain amount of work factored into that as well. But we needed to basically factor all that information in and come up with an updated plan that would be more meaningful, recognising the circumstances that are affecting us all going forward. So that's what we've done. In terms of how we're going to be conducting audits now and going forward, it'll be done remotely and perhaps with a very limited number of exceptions. We'll be actually visiting any premises and so on. That's one of the advantages of having things like Teams. You can have meetings, but you can actually share information on the screen as well in terms of systems. So we can be shown what's on a computer system that we wouldn't have been able to do previously, as well as obviously being emailed information and so on. There will be some instances where we may need to go see prime records, but we'll take the appropriate precautions and agree with the relevant service in terms of protecting those individuals, both the auditees and the auditors in that process, but that will be quite limited. We don't envisage going to establishments such as schools or social services establishments at all, given the circumstances, and again we should be able to do what we need to do remotely. But the key thing is we will need to provide the coverage that we need to give an opinion, and we are very much focusing on making sure that the basic controls that we would expect to be in place are there, but through every audit asking the question around what has actually changed since the introduction of home working and the use of technology. So that'll be a key question through all of the audits, as well as what we usually look for is looking at what's changed and looking at what has changed and coming to a view of whether they are appropriate and reasonable. You know, what might have been reasonable right at very, very early days to get things done isn't a long-term solution. So it's trying to make sure that all those things are taken into account and factored in. So what I was going to say, really, the actual detail of what we plan to look at is attached as Appendix 1. So it lists a number of things there that probably most members will be familiar with, but there's quite a an emphasis on the major financial systems, because certainly from my point of view, perhaps we wouldn't have looked at them so closely in normal circumstances, but from where I'm standing or I'm sitting, we need to make sure that the controls around some of those key financial systems are as robust as they need to be going forward, given the circumstances that I mentioned. There's time in there for National Fraud Initiative. We spoke about that a little bit earlier. There's quite a bit of time in there for that. Use of purchasing cards, because my experience elsewhere that the use of purchasing cards has increased quite significantly during this period. There's some follow-up work linked to fleet management. You had an officer come to Audit Committee previously around fleet management, so we're going to follow up on that, for example. And some of the examples in relation to schools were finishing off work that we more or less finished the tail end of last year, and some follow-up work in relation to a number of recommendations we'd made for 2 schools in particular, as well as some corporate or centralised work in relation to the education department and also in social services too. So I think that's probably all I was going to say, but happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you, Mark. You and your staff, like all the other staffs, have had to adopt and different means of working very quickly, practically in some cases, in a matter of days and overnight. So I'm sure the Audit Committee members understand the new world that we're in at the moment. Members, have you got any questions of Mark? Anyone? Yes, Councillor David Chaplin, then followed by Robert Williams.
Yeah, I don't know if you can answer this. On the list of items, item 6, the Frossafran contract payments, are we up to date with the escrow payments at the moment?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's partly why it's on the plan, is to get to an up-to-date position, because I think we've reviewed it a little while ago and made some recommendations. So it's not very many days in there at all. It's just to understand what the current situation is, really. So other than that, I can't add any more. Whether Steve is aware of anything, I'm not sure.
Before we bring Robert in, just to clarify, Councillor Chaplin, is that in relation to the fact that we're late in monies coming into the authority? Was that your particular point?
Not going into great detail. Obviously, the matter went to court.
Yeah.
A judgment was made, an appeal was lodged, and I since that time I've had very little information on whether we are or aren't receiving payments.
Yeah. I don't know. Sorry, before we bring you, Robert, Steve, have you got any up-to-date information?
Yeah, if I could add there, really, that we did have all the escrow monies in as at the end of January, but obviously because of the pandemic, like just every other organisation, companies found themselves in a difficult spot. So at the moment, we are in discussions, but we haven't had any escrow monies in for the last number of quarters.
Okay, and obviously as time goes on, the quarters will mount up, won't they?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, David, you finished?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Robert?
Thank you, Chair. I think Mark answered my first part of my question, that elements of an audit are not complete, really, with some audits where you need on-site visits. So I think you covered that. It'll be difficult for your staff, perhaps, but to be comprehensive, I assume there will be some on-site sort of visits. And the final question was in reference to the schedule there that you've got for the workload. Numbers 1 to 33, are they based on? You said they're based on your risk assessment. Are they in priority order, Mark, or are you going to have to be flexible with the amount of staff that's available and getting access and so on?
Yeah. that's good question. Normally we do present them in sort of risk priority order, but I thought it was looked better from a presentation point of view. It was better to group them together in terms of like audits or like areas, so it gives a better feel for the coverage. So they're not in any particular order. It was grouped around the nature of what they are. But you are right. I think I do mention that we don't know what's around the corner. At the time of writing this report and similar reports at other authorities, there was talk then about potential second waves and spikes, and of course that's what's happening. So none of us know how that is going to impact, both in terms of how it could impact on audit staff, how it could impact on service staff, how it could impact in terms of lockdowns and so on. So this has got to be flexible, and certain things will arise that means that, well, actually we may have to, not do certain things that are in the plan, and other things may need to be substituted. I think there's a paragraph or a sentence in there that talks about this plan will need to be even more there's always flexibility, but even more flexible than normal given the circumstances that we're in.
Hence my question in previously, Mark, where item 5 covers the impact on governance and internal control arrangements. I would have thought that that's going to be wider than much wider than just a statement like that. There's going to be a lot of operating procedures in there that are going to change.
Yeah.
And if that is the case, then are you still happy that the amount of resources you've got are going to be able to cope with it? And that's a political question, Mark.
Yeah, well, it's all, auditors are like if you ask any service manager, they would always like more staff, wouldn't they, to do what they think needs to be done. So I suppose that's my starting point. Yeah, we actually, because we went down in terms of actual vacant posts, we will be buying in some external support to help us deliver the plan using an organisation called Southwest Audit Partnership that we've used elsewhere, who are very good. So they'll be undertaking some audits, so that will assist in terms of additional resource. So I think there's enough coverage there. If we're able to deliver what's in there, then I think there's more than sufficient to give an opinion. So that's my view. Back to your point around item 5, that was just almost a starting point. We were going to use a questionnaire for some key roles and key staff to sort of try and capture that information. But I think, as I said earlier on, we'll be asking the question around like how has COVID affected things, how has remote working affected things, so what's changed from a control point of view through every audit. So yeah, so that's just a headline there, item 5, but it'll be running through all the others as well.
It's a big agenda, Mark.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Just before I do jump out and then I'll shut up, I've only just realised and take the opportunity that Gary has been off for a long time ill, and I think it would be appropriate if perhaps we could record in some way our best wishes for a speedy recovery.
Yes, yes, indeed, Robert. I don't know whether every member of the audit committee is aware, but Gary is been off for a while now. Yeah. But yes, I'm sure the committee would be more than happy to pass on our good wishes to Gary and wish him a coming back to good health in the near future. Thank you for that, Robert.
Yeah, I'll certainly pass those comments on to Gary.
Okay, that's fine. Any other questions from members? No. Oh, yeah, no questions. Your hand is still up. Oh no, it's down up. Any comments from members? No. If there are no comments from members, I'll take you back to page 48 and the recommendations under paragraph 221 that the annual internal audit risk-based plan for 2021 be approved by councillors. And again, I'll take you through asking you individually, one by one, if you approve the annual internal audit plan for 2021. Councillor David Chaplin?
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Jeremy Davis?
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Darren Roberts?
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Tony Rogers.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Declan Salmon.
Yes, Chair.
Councillor John Thomas.
Yes, Chair.
Councillor Clive Tuvey.
Yes, Chair.
Sir Robert Williams.
He's on mute.
Sorry, Chair. Yes, I'm okay.
Okay, and myself, yes. So that recommendation is approved. Then take you back to the next item on the agenda is item 6. That's internal audit information reports, 53 to 54. Can I ask if all members have had able to have access these reports? If anybody hasn't, could they indicate that they haven't had access to them? No. That's fine. And does anybody want to wish that any of these reports come before any future audit committees? No? Okay, I've just given you the opportunity. Thank you for that. And we go to item 7, that's the reflection and evaluation of the meeting. I think we've had quite a good discussion, frankly, on all the particular items there, 3, 4 and 5, covering a wide range of questions there. And item 8, any other business deemed urgent by the chair? I have none. Can I thank you all for your attendance at the audit committee? Don't forget, we have another one towards the end of next month, November. So hopefully I'll see you all then. Good to see you all.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Bye
Thank
now.
you, Chair. Good afternoon.
Thanks.